Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 13 of Two Wise Guys. We're recording live on February 10th, 2018. I'm your host, Stan, and over in Los Angeles, California is my co-host, Chris.
Hello, everyone. Got my spectacles on today. Hope it makes me a little smarter.
Very nice. And we are here to bring you a show that is based on thoughtful discussion. We discuss everything from news and politics to science and technology and everything in between. The last few episodes we've been kind of going through, and we've been talking about some lighter topics and not really focusing on anything too heavy, just because we've been tired and worn out, and the news is exhausting. So this episode we're going to kind of go back to our roots, back to the early episodes, even though we're only episode 13. We're going to kind of start off by talking a little bit about some futurism, then some postmodernism, and probably some news in there at some point too. But we invite your feedback. If anyone wants to join the conversation, the live chat is open on the YouTube page right now. We will be happy to listen to you, to talk, engage you inside the show itself. And if anyone's listening to this as a podcast, we would invite you to also leave a rating and review in your favorite podcast app. That way it helps us to move up in the rankings. And if you want to join the conversation, you can either join us live on the show. We record every other Saturday, usually about 7:30 Eastern time, 4:30 Pacific. Or you can also send your emails to the show. It's at twowiseguys.org@gmail.com. Or you can contact us directly through the website as well. So it's twowiseguys.org. But we're going to pass it over to Chris. He's going to start off with a little bit of a discussion about futurism, kind of give a basic definition, I think, maybe kind of sort of what it is, in case anyone's not aware of it. If not, I can fill in the blanks. But Chris, go ahead and take it away.
Yeah, so just wanted to start out with an interesting article that I stumbled on actually just today. It looks like it just came out today, and it's from this website called Futurism. So it's futurism.com. And we'll go ahead and share the link in the show notes, but I'm going to also share my screen with you here too, just so you can see what I'm reading. But the interesting thing here is this article, the title is "World Leaders Have Decided the Next Step in AI is Augmenting Humans." And then it sort of gives a little bit of brief discussion, setting the scene of the fact that they are having a conference in Dubai where they're meeting and talking about augmented reality as a future for the human race. So it's a panel of sort of, quote unquote experts and probably rich benefactors and that type of thing who are putting this on. But as you can see, the headline right, or one of the subheads right here, says already augmented. And I'll just sort of briefly go through this right here. But basically says that we currently are living in an augmented reality world, where at least some of our day-to-day tasks are augmented or at least supplemented by artificial intelligence. And they refer to things like Facebook, your Facebook feed. So any type of like social media feeds that you might have are actually run in part by artificial intelligence. They also give another example of a law firm called Law Geeks, which uses AI algorithms to automatically review contracts. And they're also saying that artificial intelligence is quickly becoming an invaluable resource in medicine. It's helping with administrative tasks and just all the documentation that goes on behind the scenes. So it's kind of like, sets the table here, and it's like a lot of really great stuff. And it's like, hey, augmented reality, artificial intelligence is already a big part of our lives. And then what they kind of do in the very last section here under the subhead, time to accelerate, they just sort of talk about where things are going and what the next steps are going to be. And really what it boils down to is the fact that it's going to be on the different nations of the world to sort of help each other out, and everybody's going to join forces, kind of like NATO or the United Nations, and sort of put all of our efforts together to make this artificial intelligence and augmentation and augmenting humans a reality. It says right here, I'm just going to read this highlighted section quickly before I turn it over to Dan. And it just says the panel noted that before governments can start augmenting human life, whether it be with a smart contact lenses to monitor glucose levels or turning government receptionists into AI, world leaders will need to get a sense of their nation's current standing. Quote, the main thing governments need to do first is understand where they are on this journey, one panelist noted. In the weeks and months to come, nations around the globe will likely be urged to do just that. Once nations understand where they are going along the path, ideally they will share their findings in order to assist those who are behind them and learn from those who are ahead. With a better roadmap in hand, nations will be ready to hit the road and the gas. Interesting stuff. Definitely very pro augmentation article. It's on futurism.com. So a lot of the things that they share on there are really cool. I mean, there's automation really creates a better quality of life, I guess, so that as humans, we don't have to do the menial tasks. The one that really stood out to me was the medical field, where there's already artificial intelligence in place that sort of helps out with medical documentation and papers. My wife was a medical assistant, so I'm familiar with like basically her 50% of her job at least was to handle paperwork and all these things. So how about just having a artificial intelligence take care of all that for you? So that sounds really great. But then when you kind of think about it too, there's some negatives too. If I could just share some off the top of my head, which would be people who are in the medical field in those positions would be without jobs. So then you'd have sort of like you're taking away these entry level jobs, I guess. I've seen, you know, with, for example, with like fast food chains, I've seen computer where they've already put in computers at the fast food chain's entrance where you can make an order. Here in California, Southern California, I've been in several McDonald's already that you can literally walk in and never have to talk to a human being and make your order at these machines, and then you just walk up to the counter when your number is called. So again, it sort of streamlines things, or it appears to streamline things, but I feel like there's going to be some blowback too, because a lot of these entry level jobs and positions are the ones that are going to be cannibalized by something like this. Dan, what are your thoughts on the article that I shared?
I didn't read everything in the article. I just got this a little bit ago before we started the show. But from what you were explaining about it, I have a real hard time with this idea of augmenting humans and the futurist movement in general. Mostly because I think technological advancement is great. Obviously I'm getting into a career in IT security, so technology, computers, it's all very much going to be a major part of my career and my job. But my concern is less with the technical aspect of it and more with the moral and ethical concerns that go along with it. So like, you mentioned like going to McDonald's and there's kiosks there where you can go in and just place your order without having to talk to anybody. How much longer and that kind of thing, I can appreciate the jobs argument because you can even look at like something that more people might be familiar with who maybe haven't seen that at their own McDonald's, but something that they could probably relate to a bit better is like the self-checkout lane at like grocery store or at a Walmart or something like that, or at a Target or wherever you prefer to go. Most stores that you go to, a lot of these big box retailers will oftentimes they'll have big box is not a good word for it, but anyways, a lot of times they'll have these self-checkout lines where you can go through, you can check your stuff out. But what ends up happening is that then it starts out where you have the employee who's working there, you have the self-checkout lanes as well. And as people start going to the self-checkout more, they start staffing less and less of their own clerks to work there. And so what's happening is less with, I wouldn't refer to that so much as augmentation as automation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually have a grocery store that's right around the corner from me that had those self-checkout lines and then removed them. The reason when I asked them why they removed them, they said that people were actually leaving the store without paying for certain things. So that sort of was bringing up their theft a little bit. But I heard numbers of people who went through there who they really enjoyed that service, but the store was always seemed like it was always understaffed and stuff. So that's a little beside the point. But I am aware of, I think when you're referring to big box retailers, one that comes to mind immediately is, of course, Amazon. And they have a couple stores where you literally don't have to check out. You put your stuff, you literally carry your stuff out the door, whatever you choose, and you're charged for it when you leave. So literally you cannot steal anything. because as soon as something with a tag or whatever passes through the door, your account is charged for it. So that to me is like where it's headed. And I'm sure even further beyond that, but that seems pretty advanced to me. What's your take on that Amazon store?
I think it's a bold thing to do. Trust people to not go in and steal your stuff. I'm assuming they probably have security or someone to make sure that they don't just walk off with whatever. Because it's got. I don't really know how it all works. I'm sure it probably is. I think you have to like scan the barcode with your phone or something, and that charges it to your Amazon account or something along the ways.
Actually, what happens is the there's like scanners when you leave, and I guess it's like GPS, or I don't know how it all works, but it's like that NFC communication.
Uh-huh.
So it detects that stuff. But when you leave, so whenever you leave, like the mall or something, you know how you have like those little security things or whatever, and I guess it detects like those magnetic strips that are in certain high value products. Well, works kind of on the same premise as that, I believe, where every single item that's in there is tagged, and as soon as you walk out, as soon as you pass through the scanner through the door, your Amazon account is charged for that. Now, I would assume in order to gain access to the store in the first place, it would be something along the lines of when you go into a Sam's Club with a membership, you have to show your ID card to even get in.
Mm-hmm.
So there would be like probably some sort of security or a couple of security people at the door to administer that at the very least. But when you think about it financially from the terms of from the point of view from a company like Amazon is, well, we don't have to pay for all these cashiers. We can have literally as many people. The store could be as busy as we want, and people can leave and go whenever they want, never having to check out. And we don't have to pay for any cashiers, just a couple of security dudes,
Right.
and whoever's in the back sort of stocking the shelves.
Right. And I mean, and the thing is, I mean, it is what it is. I probably would never go to one just because it's kind of weird, but I don't know. I think to get back on topic, as far as the AI thing and the augmentation of humanity, I have a hard time with it because I look at it more in terms of a moral aspect. To me, it crosses the line of we're trying harder and harder to gain a level of advancement to where we can rival God. And some people are okay with that. I'm personally not. And, I've often told people in the past that if it came down to it where we had the option to get implants or get things like that, I would never do it because I have a strongly held conviction that is, one, it's dangerous. Two, I have moral problems with it as well. And that is because I'm a religious person. I'm a Christian, so I don't, I don't believe in altering the human state in that way. And that's not to say that like you can't have a pacemaker or something like that, or some machine that helps you in some way. I'm not even opposed to things like exoskeletons, which some companies use to help their workers lift, heavy things safer. I think that's kind of cool. And honestly, if I could get like an Iron Man suit, I totally would. But it's the idea of trying to find a way to capture the human psyche, the human spirit, and then plant that into a machine. That's where I feel like that's crossing the line of just cool scientific advancements into something that is more of a dangerous territory of trying to play God, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, I completely agree with you. I think from the augmenter's point of view, it's not necessarily capturing the human psyche as much as it is augmenting and making it better. So people like Ray Kurzweil have actually, and this is just in reference to AI, not necessarily augmentation, but he says that he believes that AI is going to be able to pass the Turing test as early as 2029. So that's about a 10 years, a little over a decade before that happens. And then he believes that full-on augmentation will be occurring. In other words, where we will have certain implants and whatnot in our bodies to help us with our everyday tasks and everything. That would occur closer to 2045. For me, the augmentation, and this is where this article that I just read, I feel like is sort of like kind of doing a little bit of lawyer speak in a way, because they're like, well, you're already augmented, not physically, but you're participating in an augmented reality by participating in social media, by doing Google searches, by doing any number of things that are, like Alexa and Siri and all this stuff. These are all artificial intelligences that are used on a daily basis by humans. So what they're doing is they're kind of like almost like softening like the blow, like, well, you've already been involved with artificial intelligence for some time now, and this is just sort of the direction that it's going. Things are only going to get better from here. So I think that's what they're trying. That's the bill of goods that they're selling from their point of view, is like, hey, this can only make things better. This can only improve society. It can only make society more secure. It can only make people smarter and therefore better. Because that's constantly seems to be the argument that I hear from that side of the table, from the augmenters, pro augmentation side of the table, which is, you're going to be better. I hear the term superhuman get thrown around. I hear the term super intelligence get thrown around because, and I hear like other terms from more, I guess, like not religious, but I don't even know what the term that, but I hear other terms like oneness. Everybody's going to kind of become more of like one mind, and everybody's going to be more in more unity, which is, of course, something that's a big deal now, because we turn on the news and we see all of this news about division and how we need to come together and all this stuff. So, and I feel like augmented reality proponents are sort of preying on that in a way, like we're going to bring everything together. We're going to bring, all roads lead to this, basically. It's and that's another thing that they seem like from the articles and the that I've read is it seems like all roads lead to augmentation and artificial intelligence becoming sort of ubiquitous, and really there's nothing you can do about it. It's an event inevitability.
Right, and that's I think where I have my problem with it, and where I draw the conflict is that it sounds great in theory, but eventually what happens then is, it could start out as completely voluntary and it's not a big deal, and a handful of people do it. Probably would start with like celebrities or the ultra wealthy, who have the means to make those things happen. But what it does is that it then proceeds to set a moral precedent, and it has implications that we may not be foreseeing right now, or the people who are foreseeing those implications are ruled out as
inferior.
Well, maybe that too, but I'm thinking more in terms of I can't think of the word. Somebody who a catastrophist kind of thing. Like they
like left behind, kind of like bitter clingers.
I guess kind of like that. I'm talking more. I'm not talking about in the future when this stuff is happening. I'm talking about now, as the people are pushing for these things.
I got you.
The people who resist the idea of augmenting oneself with technology in that way, that they're seen as just the kind of people who are afraid of progress, afraid of advancement. And so inevitably what happens is, as it becomes more and more popular and people embrace it more and it becomes more prevalent within society, it's you've seen the movie Gattaca, correct?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, so in the movie Gattaca, for those of you who have not seen it, it's about genetic manipulation, genetic engineering, and splicing. And it kind of takes the genetic editing and gene splicing that we do now and takes it to a more extreme conclusion, which is that people are basically able to manufacture their babies in a way that they no longer have to worry about certain diseases. They don't have to worry about birth defects and things that sound good. But what ends up happening is this one individual, actually, it's not just one, I guess there's a whole group of them, who are not genetically modified because their parents were purists or whatever they called it in the movie, ended up becoming second-class citizens. They ended up becoming, as you said, inferiors, to where they ended up having the only job they could really have was to be the janitors who mop the floors, if that makes sense. No knock on janitors, they do a good job too. But that's my concern with this kind of stuff. And so it does go into terms with the idea of gene editing, genetic manipulation, augmenting the human condition. It's that I tend to see things more in the possible, the theoretical of the future. And when I see these things, based on my understanding of history and understanding how the world works, understanding human nature, it's that it's not going to lead to this utopian paradise where everyone's happy and everything's great all the time. It's inevitably there's going to be one group who, who deems that somebody else, for whatever reason, whether it be that they're not augmented or they're not genetically, they're genetically inferior, that they are then going to be persecuted and subjected to tyranny, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. Well, so what you're saying is, you don't necessarily buy into this, and you feel that that it's not going to make things better, basically. Now, what would you say to someone who is like, well, okay, you're kind of like behind the eight ball here. You're clinging on to some like old values, and you're not being very progressive. You're resisting change. What would you say to someone like that, who is thinking like that? Who's, for example, like a pro AI, pro augmentation type of thing. Oh, there's there's no real danger. Everything's going to be fine. You're just being silly. We've seen progress happen, over the millennia, and people who resisted the change were always left behind. And this is just another case of that.
I would say that there's no historical evidence to support that claim, generally speaking, because, I mean, we're even seeing it today, and this is going to kind of go off topic a little bit, but there's been a resurgence in recent years in naturopathy, for instance, using medicinal herbs, using natural remedies to deal with things. Now, there's certainly a place for modern medicine. Don't get me wrong. Like, I try to, in our family, we try to do things as natural as possible, and there's a lot of things that, as my wife has tried to introduce me to, that are more natural remedies that I haven't necessarily mocked her about it, but kind of like condescending, like that's cute, whatever, because it doesn't
for you. Then go ahead.
Yeah, I'm like, that's fine, whatever. But it's the more I've had to, that I've experimented with these things, the more I'm really amazed at the way that these things work. And I don't really understand the science behind it, but what I do understand is that these things work. These are natural things that have been on the earth forever. Lavender is very relaxing. That's why they put it in all sorts of soaps. That's why they put it in candles. That's why they put it in everything, because it's just something that helps relax an individual. And for whatever reason, it works. Now, you can take, some sort of a pharmaceutical that's going to help you to relax, or you could do something that's not going to harm your body. And so what's happening now is we've gone the route of, and this is, I guess, kind of tying into the postmodern thing as well, is that, we've gone down the route of mechanizing everything, of industrializing everything, of making everything this sterile, human-created society. And we've started coming back from that now, saying, okay, that was too far to the extreme. Let's come back to the more natural now. And obviously, I'm speaking in generalities. This isn't true for everybody. There's a lot of people who think that it's all ridiculous, and some of it is, but I think it's interesting that I think it's really interesting that we're so convinced of our own knowledge and insight that we're unwilling to accept that perhaps we don't have it all figured out, and we're playing with some very big things that have very major implications, if that makes sense. And I would liken it to, and this is probably hyperbole, but I'm going to liken it to the innovation of nuclear weapons. Nuclear energy is great, it's clean, all that good stuff, unless there's a meltdown, which doesn't happen that often, but I'm still on the fence about nuclear power. But as far as nuclear weapons go, that was the pinnacle of weapon creation for mankind. There's never been anything stronger than nuclear weapons, and hopefully there never will be. But the men who created the nuclear or the atomic bombs back in World War II, obviously they were doing it to try and achieve it before Hitler and the Nazis did. But do you really think that they had an understanding? Like, there's a reason why there's accounts of these scientists who, as they were going through and they were developing these weapons, they had no idea the implications of what would happen. They had no idea about the fallout that would happen. They had no idea about the birth defects and the cancers that would be caused because of it, or the sheer destructive power of these weapons. And once it's been created, it's unleashed it, and it's a Pandora's box that cannot be closed again. And so that's my concern. My response to somebody who would say that I'm behind the eight ball, or whatever expression you want to use, and that I'm going to be left behind, that I'm on the wrong side of history, as a lot of people would probably like to say, is I think you should really take a step back, consider all the options. It's basic game theory. You consider all your options, you consider the positive and the negative, and what's most likely to happen. And that's all I'm doing. Is I can see a very good use case for this kind of stuff, and I'm not necessarily opposed to it in terms of certain elements, as long as it's done within moderation. But I'm concerned for, to be completely blunt, the future of humanity, because of the choices that are being made for us by a select group of people, notably people like these futurists, people who are pushing for further developing AI, which there's different levels of AI. We just kind of use it as a throwaway term, but there's artificial intelligence, which is just pre-programmed things that have all the information they can use, and they can't learn beyond that. Then there's artificial general intelligence, and then there's artificial super intelligence. And so with all these things, I feel like people need to take a step back. They're playing with fire. They need to be more careful, and they need to really consider, is this avenue worth pursuing further? Because if we go down this road and we make a bad decision, there's not going to be any going back from it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And we've seen examples of artificial intelligences on the web. And I think I've referenced this particular one in the show before, but there was one that was, I think it was Microsoft had essentially a Twitter bot, and it was tabbed as an artificial intelligence. And basically, it's, if you want to picture like a small child being released to be able to do what they want, with basically no rules other than to stay within the bounds of Twitter itself. And go figure what happens. The child starts to learn to swear, learns to insult people and threaten people and whatnot. So this quote artificial intelligence kind of got out of hand, to the point, I think it only lasted like it was between 24 to 48 hours before Microsoft shut it down, because it was literally it was becoming a PR nightmare, really, because of the things that it was doing and saying to people. And essentially what they had tabbed it as is it was going to learn from other people. So the conversations that this bot had on Twitter, it was going to learn from those conversations and sort of build upon that. But as we all know, Twitter can be a very vicious place. And I guess that artificial intelligence ended up being pretty vicious itself and getting shut down. But to that point, that artificial intelligence was operating within the bounds of Twitter, right? So it's got to stay within that sort of like those borders, if you will, and it can't leave that. But what happens when there's an artificial intelligence, like you're saying, like when artificial intelligence, let's take it a few steps down the road where it becomes like a super intelligence, and is able to pass a Turing test, in the words of Ray Kurzweil. What happens when something like that is released and sort of tested and allowed to be free? We've all seen movies. I mean, obviously, the first thing that comes to mind is the Terminator movies with Genesis Network, and what happened there. And obviously, I don't want to be like a doomsayer or anything like that. I'm not saying that that's what's going to happen, but it does. I do. What I'm saying, I guess, through all this is I do agree with you. I do think it's a dangerous road. I think it's a slippery slope that we do have to be careful. And we're not the only ones. We're not even the most well-known people. I mean, the owner of Tesla has come out and said that he opposes what's going on with artificial intelligence at this point. And let's not even mention the fact that these artificial intelligences, whatever might be, we might be augmenting ourselves with those. What happens if an artificial intelligence that's integrated into my body is able to somehow commandeer control of certain functions of my body? What happens at that point? So that there's just a lot of unknowns. I agree with you. It's very slippery slope and very challenging, and I think it's a Pandora's box we don't want to open, but unfortunately, I think it is going to be opened.
I think it is too, but that's what I'm saying. I'm like, there are ways to do these kind of things in a way that is safe and morally reasonable. So I'm not trying to be a doomsayer. I'm just trying to urge caution. That's always kind of been my big thing. And you mentioned, who did you just mention that it's kind of warning? Elon Musk.
Yeah, the owner of Tesla.
He warns about AI a lot, and so like Chris said, it's not just you and I who are sitting here, a couple of podcasters sitting here talking about, the dangers of AI because Skynet's coming online, and I've seen iRobot one too many times. It's I think people identify Elon Musk as someone who has a good understanding of these things. I'm pretty sure he even owns an AI company, so he knows he sees what's happening.
Yeah, which is a point I was going to bring up, because Elon Musk has sort of been painted as this humanitarian, but he, in fact, the Tesla automobiles themselves were some of the pioneers in automatic driving, so driverless cars essentially, and they don't exactly have a perfect record with that, but so that seems interesting too. You have the owner of a company who's pushing for artificial intelligence like features in an automobile, so that people don't have to drive, yet he's sort of against releasing this. So that leaves me wondering what exactly he's talking about, as far as like what level of artificial intelligence he's referring to. And like you referred to artificial super intelligence. So I don't know how familiar you are with this, but are there different levels of artificial intelligence? Are there sort of like theirs or what?
Well, yeah. So as far as I understand it, there's three main levels of artificial intelligence. There's artificial intelligence, which it's things like you could say it's like the Microsoft bot on Twitter. You could say it's the what do you call it? The algorithms on Facebook or on Amazon that help you find related items to what you're looking at. Those technically, I guess you could consider to be artificial intelligence. It's also things like, are you familiar with Deep Blue, the computer that I think it was back in the 70s, ready to beat the chess master? That was artificial intelligence. That was a machine that was programmed with a certain framework of information, a certain framework of data that was utilizing that data to process very rapidly all of the possible move sets. It can't learn anything beyond that, but it's been programmed with all those things. And so what, for instance, I think it's in Korea, maybe they're working on robotic doctors and nurses. And so like, rather than having a doctor come in and talk to you or a nurse come in and talk to you when you go to the doctor's office, having them come in, you share your information about what your symptoms are, and then they use voice recognition and then process it. And then based on what you've told them, they help figure out, they can try to usually deduce down to a relatively short list of possible ailments what you might be suffering from. Then the doctor comes in, they look at it, and they tell you what to do and everything, and then they go on. But beyond that is artificial general intelligence, which is where the machine is able to learn, but it's able to do things in a way and make decisions in a way that similar to what a human would be able to do. And super intelligence is beyond that, to where the computer is able to understand things, process things, make decisions, come to conclusions far faster than any human would possibly be able to do so.
It has more freedom. Am I understanding that correctly? It has more freedom or access to more.
No, it can. No, it's that these things are these. It's not necessarily that they have more information; it's that they're able to learn, and because of that, they're able to use the data that they have and the data that they have acquired over the years, over the weeks, months, whatever the time frame is, and they're able to use that to make things, to understand things, to solve problems and stuff like that. So, like when we talk about, the machines from iRobot, or you talk like so for instance, iRobot's a good movie to talk about because in that movie you have the humans, you have their helper robots, and then you have the mainframe. The machines in there, like especially the older bots, that are just there to help people, those would be artificial general intelligence. They're able to figure things out. They stay within the laws of robotics. They're able to help you out, and he needs to go into the other room to get you your medicine. He knows to walk across the room, open the door, go to the room, find the stuff you're looking for, bring it back out, open the bottle, give it to you. And that's general intelligence. That's the same. It's on par with what a human can do, generally speaking. And the super intelligence would be the mainframe there that is able to deduce and reason based on the condition of humanity, the world, and human nature, that the ultimate threat to human safety is human freedom. And so the ultimate solution to that is to enslave humanity, to keep them safe from themselves. and so it then orders the lesser robots to follow those initial orders of to protect the people that they're there to help by following what the super intelligence has deduced is the only way to keep people from hurting each other, if that makes sense. So things like that, things like Skynet from Terminator, those would be like super intelligence level kind of AI things.
Are they super intelligent? Sorry to stop you there, but are they super intelligent because they have access to greater control? For example, the ones you mentioned being the mainframe and the Terminator, like the Skynet, which I misquoted earlier and called Genesis. But so like Skynet, is that because it has access to a lot of different controls? Like in other words, like if you could picture it like a circuit board, have like a music or a soundboard having a lot of different controls on it. But then imagine like a soundboard that's able to control and manipulate things all over the world. Is that what you're referring to, the level of control?
Not necessarily. I think Skynet's not necessarily a good example because it's such a hyped up movie, but maybe a better example is the movie War Games, the computer Joshua. Have you seen War Games? No. Okay. So brief rundown. War Games was a movie that came out in the late 80s, starring Matthew Broderick, and he's a kid who's a computer hacker, and he thinks he's hacking into a video game website or a video games network company. This is back before the internet, but he's on what was the predecessor to the internet, and he manages to hack into this gaming company's website. That's not actually, it's hard to explain in 2018. But he gets in there and he sees this list of games that he wants to play, and they're tic-tac-toe, checkers, chess, stuff like that. And then one of the games, as it gets further down, the games become more they become war games, if that makes sense. And so one of the games that he chooses to play because he thinks it'll be fun is called Global Thermonuclear War. And so he starts playing it, starts having a good time, and all the while he's playing against an AI machine that's called Joshua. And as he's playing the game, he has some fun with it. He has to shut it off and everything, but the game keeps playing. What he doesn't realize is that what he's done is he's hacked into a supercomputer at NORAD and out in the middle of the mountains of Colorado or wherever it's at. And so what he's done is he's triggered a war game within a supercomputer that's about to launch all America's nuclear arsenal at the Soviet Union because he was playing as the Russians attacking America. So they're then thinking that they're under attack. And so what they end up doing, I'm going to give spoilers, but the movie is literally like 30 years old, so tough. It's one of those things where towards the end of it, he has the computer play itself in a game of tic-tac-toe repeatedly to where the machine is able to learn the lesson that to where it's able to learn that I'm trying to think of what it was, to learn that there's no solution to that game. There's no way to really win that game because it's constantly a draw. Occasionally you might win, but if you're playing it on a supercomputer level, it's always going to be a draw. And so sometimes the best option is not to play the game at all. And that's the big moral takeaway from it that averts the nuclear war, and in general. And so that's kind of an example of artificial superintelligence, is that it's able to take in data from external sources, but it's able to also learn from its own choices, its own mistakes, and have its own cognizant thoughts, if that makes sense.
That's interesting, the movie you shared, because it seems to me like obviously tic-tac-toe to me is like a very simplistic game. And like you said, even on like a human level of anybody who knows how to play the game, it's like, okay, this is going to be a draw every time. So it's like taking something super simple and then showing the computer of something that's very complex and like, okay. But where does someone to use another movie example, but where does HAL 9000 fall into something like this? Is he a super intelligence?
To be honest, I haven't seen the movie.
You've never seen 2000? Okay.
I've not. I'm sorry.
2001 Space Odyssey was one of the pioneering space films, sci-fi films of all time. And I guess that word gets thrown around a lot with sci-fi, but this was literally made in the 60s. So it has to be one of the pioneering ones because it was very early on. But to make a long story short, in this movie, basically they are traveling to, I think it's Mars or something like that. But they're on a spaceship that's traveling into deep space. There's several humans on there, and the spaceship is basically run by this computer called HAL 9000, and it's very iconic because it's just this red circle dot in the middle of like this circular screen. And I think just about everybody has seen that image, if they, even if they haven't seen the movie. But to make a long story short, again, HAL 9000 ends up calculating that he needs to preserve himself along, which seems to happen a lot in artificial intelligence related movies. But he starts basically killing crew members by, you know, doing whatever he can in space, which is, you know, amounts to like ejecting them out of the, you know, the hatches and to space without spacesuits, and, you know, doing different things like that, to the point where I think just about everybody dies before they are able to get him shut down. So I guess I'm kind of answering my own question here, but he is an artificial intelligence and he's learning and he's sort of diabolical. And that's interesting because it seems like if you take at least the example of the Microsoft Twitter bot super or artificial intelligence, it kind of became diabolical to the point, or at least a problem enough of a point, that they had to shut it down, you know, because it was going to be at least become a PR nightmare. And it just begs for me the question, is that sort of like the default path that is taken by anything that's super intelligence is something that's diabolical? And I'm asking that because self-preservation almost always makes its way to the top of the list when you're talking about something that's intelligent, super intelligent or whatever, because it has this need to preserve itself. If you look at the human species, all we can, you know, one of the big things we can talk about is how can we live forever? How can we extend our lives so we can live longer? And so a super intelligent artificial intelligence, to think that way of extending itself, and if you're going to protect your own existence at the cost of all others, then that kind of makes you a bad guy, doesn't it? Because inevitably you're going to perceive somebody else or something else as a threat at a given point in time and have to say, well, we got to deal with this threat over here by removing that threat. And that usually removing a threat that's organic usually means killing it. Would you say that's a correct assumption? That it's sort of becomes a diabolical thing with these artificial intelligence?
Not necessarily. I think that with artificial intelligence and machine learning and stuff like that, it's based on programming. It doesn't have sentience. It doesn't have human emotions, if that makes sense. Which is why there are people who are currently trying to develop algorithms and trying to develop code that will allow machines to, in a way, understand and express human emotions and feelings. So, for instance, those nurse robots that, you know, in Korea or wherever it is, who come in and they will diagnose a patient. It's not enough to simply diagnose them and maybe even tell them what's going on. A person in that kind of situation, that kind of condition, needs to have, you know, a level of human interaction to where they're able to know, you know, empathy, if that makes sense. And so they're trying to program that into these machines so that they can express empathy, even though they're machines. They don't actually feel. They don't actually think for themselves. And so that's the difference. It's like what you're talking about is more based on just general programming. It's the Microsoft bot wasn't general intelligence because it wasn't self-aware and learning. It was taking in more data. The more that people were communicating with it, the more data was being added to its you know, frame of knowledge, and that was what was influencing it. It wasn't influencing its own thought by its own thought, if that makes sense.
I see. So you're saying because probably because the majority of the data he was taking in was somewhat, shall we say, negative or sort of attacking. That's sort of what he became, because it's like, well, he's assimilating all of this knowledge and using that knowledge.
Yeah. So, like, for instance, if Microsoft had open sourced the code and we were able to take that and put it into a closed environment in a church, that bot would end up sounding different than it would if you put it into a public high school, or if you put it into, you know, a fire station or something like that, and it was learning from different groups of people. It's taking in information from its surroundings and from the people who are interacting with it, and it's basically just regurgitating what it's been hearing, but doing it in its own way, if that makes sense.
Gotcha. So, and this will be the last. I have one more question before we sort of segue into postmodernism. But so, what happens when you have an artificial intelligence? You know, and this is sort of theorizing, but what happens when you have artificial intelligence that has access to basically all of the information on the planet. So there's no limit to the access of the information. It's able to sort of perceive comings and goings. It's able to perceive conflict, various conflicts, wars, and whatnot. In addition to, so just everything on the planet, all the goings on. So there's definitely peaceful resolutions that are being come to, but there's also wars that are being started. There's also conflict. There's a lot of things. What do you think happens to an artificial intelligence that's able to perceive all of that? What's sort of the frame of reference? What's the sort of the conclusion that it makes? Does it need to take action, or does it need, what does it become? Does it become sort of like this philanthropist, if you will, or does it become sort of a more of a diabolical character where it's like, okay, we need to deal with this firmly and make sure these people can't hurt themselves?
Rephrase your question. I wasn't really clear on what you're asking. I'm sorry.
I guess the question is, if an artificial intelligence has access to all the information on the planet, and in other words, everything that's happening on the planet, that's not necessarily plugged into everything, but it's able to perceive everything that's happening on the planet, from wars to famines to natural disasters to everything. And I'm just sort of taking from what you're saying, like an artificial intelligence takes the information that it's given and assimilates it, and sort of, I guess, regurgitates it. So it's not able to come up with anything new of its own. So if an artificial intelligence, in theory, had access to all that information, all the information on the planet, would it be a benevolent artificial intelligence, or would it be something that's sort of like more diabolical and wants to take control of everything to make everything work out? And again, this is just theory, but in your opinion, what would happen?
I mean, it depends on what kind of artificial intelligence we're talking about. If it's just regular artificial intelligence, it's not going to do anything. It's not going to be benevolent. It's not going to be malevolent. It's just going to be what it is. It's just going to be a database of information that is able to solve basic problems based on what it's been programmed to do. If we're talking general intelligence, then it starts to be able to think for itself and starts to really consider things. But it's when we start getting into the super intelligence levels that I think the concern is, because if you look at the history of mankind, you look at the history of the world, you look at the wars that we've fought, you look at the inventions we've created that oftentimes have led to more death and more conflict. And obviously not everything is bad that we've done. We've created some wonderful things. Automobiles are good, but even an automobile, something as simple as an automobile or an airplane that poses a risk. If the machine's primary goal, for instance, is to better human life, that term the term to better human life needs to be defined in order for the AI to do its job. And so if you have just a regular machine, a regular AI who's been programmed to reduce human fatalities,
like reduce conflict, fatalities,
things like that, and you get into the super intelligence level, ultimately the deduction, the only thing that from a strictly mechanical point of view, the only thing that's going to be, the only solution that there's going to be, it's not going to be it's not going to be malevolent in nature. It's just the only rational decision that it can come to is to find a way to stop humans from doing the bad things that we do. I mean, we're the only beings in the world that have a conscience, that have the ability to think on a higher level. And I mean, people will say that apes are very smart and stuff like that too, or dolphins, but I'm like, they don't build cities, they don't build weapons, they don't run governments, they don't do these things. That's just not how they work, biologically speaking, scientifically speaking. Humans are the only ones who do that. And so if the goal of the AI or the ASI or whatever is to stop the world from, we'll take climate change for instance, because that's a hot button topic. If they program it where the goal is to figure out the best solution to stop climate change, to save the world, and the information, the data that's being programmed into it is that it's man-made climate change, and it's because we're doing X, Y, and Z that's causing the world to fall apart. What do you think the ultimate solution is? It's very simple. Like the only solution that there really is to stop the humans from doing the things that the humans are doing. Whether or not that's actually the case, I mean, there's a lot of variables that go into that. What's that?
So that's the solution, but how do you stop the humans from doing what they're doing? And I think that the answer to that question is what makes it. Is this a malevolent or right?
Well, so okay, so well, to quote Dr. Landy or Landing from iRobot, that is the correct question, because ultimately with that kind of thing, what you're coming to is who's the enforcer of these things that the machines are coming now. In the Terminator and iRobot, it was the machines that were linked into the system. Right. But if it's being used as a tool by governments or by other entities who may have access to this, maybe the UN or maybe some other entity that's not around yet, and the machine reports back to them, they're going to get that analysis, and it's up to them to do it. So ultimately, it comes back on human nature. And if we're programming, if we get it to a point to where all the information that we're putting in is like not necessarily sharing all sides of a very complex issue, what we're going to end up having is just one perspective. Oftentimes, that ends up being askew from what the rest of the world needs to really survive, that kind of thing, if that makes sense. And again, I'm kind of taking it to the extreme, because when you're doing game theory, you have to go to all the logical conclusions, and sometimes that means you have to go to the negative ones. The machine itself is not good or bad, it's just a machine. And now there's some people who have talked about machine rights or robot rights or stuff like that, but I think that's a load of nonsense. But the big idea is that they're tools that are being used by individuals, and it accelerates our ability to process information, it accelerates our ability to learn things. But the general rule in any kind of coding is garbage in, garbage out. Depending on what you put into it, you're going to get a specific outcome. Now, if we upload an artificial super intelligent computer with all the information available from every source, of any kind of thing that's in the world, you're going to have everything from the ancient Masoretic text of the Hebrew Bible. You're going to have the Futurist Manifesto. You're going to have like alt-right things from the Daily Stormer. You're going to have things from Huffington Post. You're just going to have all these different things in there, so you never know what that's going to turn out, because that's just all sorts of information. But if it's individuals who are programming this thing, they're going to put in there what they acknowledge as true and accurate, if that makes sense. Am I making any kind of sense? I feel like I'm kind of jumping all over the place.
No, you make sense. And you brought up a few questions, and I wasn't intending to sort of carry this on, but it's just such an interesting topic. When you say that it has access to all that information, and artificial intelligence has access to all that information, for example, the Masoretic text and the Futurist Manifesto, to bring a few points, what is the conclusion that it comes to? Because to me, an artificial intelligence that's been created sort of, I guess we could say, like by natural means, it's not supernatural, it's not, anything like that. Why would it believe what's in the Masoretic text? Why would it believe the information that come from some of these religious texts above, say, scientific information that's been proven, to be correct? Wouldn't the machine logically go with what it knows to be true rather than what could be true?
I guess it depends all on the way the machine is programmed. For instance, for example, if if CERN, I'm sure they probably have a supercomputer or something like that. If CERN has a supercomputer and they are the ones who program the operating system, program all the data into it, it's going to be processing the data that CERN put in there. Now, for instance, just a ridiculous other side of that is, what if the Westboro Baptist Church, who most people probably have heard of, if not, they're a French church. They're they've been notable in the past for going to like funerals of soldiers and other a variety of other things. I can't think of what else they've been to, but they're a hate group basically. I don't accept them as their claim as being members of the Christian church, because their message is completely antithetical. I think they're a cult personally. But if they were to have a supercomputer and they programmed it with their information, it's going to come out very differently than what CERN would have, for instance. And so, their understanding of the Bible and of the world, or the flat earthers are a good example. People who believe that the earth is flat, they're going to not, what you put into a machine is what you're going to get out of it. It doesn't matter if it's intelligent, general intelligence, super intelligent, it doesn't matter. What you're going to get out of it is what you program into it. That's just how machines work. That's how computers work. And so, like I said, if you put every bit of information that every human has ever had into a machine, into a computer, you're going to get a wide variety of things. But the thing that this is where I kind of stop understanding fully how it works. It has to find a way to maybe even not even necessarily discern, but to take in that information and to play things out, to figure out what the most appropriate response is, whether or not that's
like you would with a checkbook. It's got to reconcile the information, figure out
right.
what the option is, and say, okay, this is the best outcome that we could have. Let's go this direction. Like a chess game, like a super complicated chess game, war games.
Yeah, it's like playing 6D chess or something like that. One thing I wanted to share before we move on, unless you had more questions, I'm gonna screen share it for the audio listeners. This is an article from Newsweek. I remember hearing about this a while ago. I'm sure it's probably on other sources too, but this was the first one that popped up.
Screen blank. I don't know if that's intentional.
Oh boy, that's great. Way to fail, Google. I don't know what the deal is with it, so I'm not going to worry about it. But basically what it is, it's an article from Newsweek. I'll have a link in the show notes for it, because we had mentioned Elon Musk warning about AI. Some people won't necessarily take that as credible, but actually the first person I heard warning about AI in the past was Stephen Hawking. And the headline reads, Stephen Hawking, AI warning artificial intelligence could destroy civilization. And it goes on to explain his view on it. So I'll throw that in the show notes for anyone who's interested. But basically, he's one of the most revered theoretical physicists in the world. Everybody knows the name Stephen Hawking because of his understanding of science, understanding of the universe, and the way things work scientifically. And even he's the one warning about the dangers of continuing down this road unchecked, if that makes sense. So, go ahead.
Yeah, he's definitely a prominent AI alarmist. And again, like you hear some of these people talking about artificial intelligence like this, and it's like, okay, for everything that we've discussed about artificial intelligence dealing with the information that it's given, and it's sort of a neutral thing because it's a computer. For that to be true, it just seems. I'm not saying I disagree with you, because I do agree with you on a lot of those points. Very sound reasoning. Why should we be afraid of artificial intelligence if what you're saying, it's only the information that it's given that can only process those things, and it's not necessarily an inherently evil thing, it's more neutral? Why should we be afraid of artificial intelligence?
I don't think we should be afraid of artificial intelligence. I think we should be concerned and cautious when it comes to artificial superintelligence. And my concern with general intelligence even is not so much a risk to human existence. It's more of a moral concern of, then we have to start dealing with the issue of, we've created this machine and it's become self-aware. It recognizes that it is sentient to the point where it's able to think and understand that it has its own thoughts. How do we then respond to the idea of destroying that machine? Does that count as murder? There are all of these social implications that go along with that I don't think a lot of people are really considering, and the people who are trying to work around that by giving it emotions, by trying to draft a robotic bill of rights and things like that. That's more my concern with that. My concern with the superintelligence is, once artificial intelligence accelerates beyond the point of human understanding, that's when we start getting into the realm of the unknown, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and that's such a hard thing to quantify, because it's like, when you're talking about something beyond your own understanding, you just can't understand it because it's beyond your own understanding. Which kind of brings us to our closing point. And I just wanted to touch upon postmodern philosophy, if you will, just a little bit, because one of the things that the Futurism article brought up that I read at the beginning of the broadcast was that, well, we're already using augmented intelligence. We're already using artificial intelligence in an augmented way to augment our own knowledge and everything with things like Google web search. Again, just to rehash, but using our phones to get onto different platforms that are social media, so like Facebook, sorting images and everything that to what the artificial intelligence believes is most relevant to each individual person using these platforms. So artificial intelligence is supposedly already augmenting our existence, and it's only going to move things further. But one of the things that I feel that's being hurt by this, in addition to everything that we've just talked about, is human thought as its, sort of as its own entity, if you will. And what I mean by that is because we're essentially augmenting our abilities with these things, it's taken away. In a way, it's like when you have a muscle that you don't use, it atrophies. So it's like people who work out and exercise, lift weights, their muscles get bigger because they're getting stronger because they're being used. And to use that analogy on the human brain, the human psyche, if you're not using it, or it's not properly, or to take that even a step further, for people who are younger and growing up in this environment, if it's not even properly developing in the first place, you're not able to experience the emotions in the same way. You're not able to experience critical thinking on a subject matter in the same way because a person is so used to having the information fed to them, I guess. And it brings up this point of kind of why we wanted to start this show in the first place, which is to help people to think for themselves, to think critically, to really think through things for themselves, and not just be consumers of the information that's given to us on the web or wherever we might be getting it from. And that's the issue of kind of where I think postmodern philosophy has led us. And I'm just going to read a clip from, or a quote from, the postmodern philosophy definition here on Wikipedia, if I may, to sort of set the table for that. But it says here, postmodernist thinkers developed concepts like difference, repetition, trace, and hyperreality to subvert, quote, grand narratives, end quote, univocity of being, and epistemic certainty. Those are a lot of big words. Postmodern philosophy questions the importance of power relationships, personalization, and discourse in the, quote, construction, end quote, of truth and worldviews. Many postmodernists appear to deny that an objective reality exists and appear to deny that there are objective moral values. And I guess the way that I'm interpreting that sort of in a nutshell is that postmodern, and again, Dan, you're more of the expert in this than me, but the way that I'm interpreting that clip right there is that postmodern thinking sort of is saying that there's no absolutes, there's no moral absolute, there's no real truth. It's only what you make of it. It's only that reality is what you perceive, not what you're told. And to bring it back to sort of that moral thing, there's no real truth. So it's sort of like, and I could be wrong here, but I feel like it's sort of anti-religious because religion sort of gives you these presupposed notions, I guess. Like for example, the Bible's got all this information, like the 10 Commandments, for example. It's like, don't do these things, 1 through 10. Don't do any of these things because they're bad. And I guess a postmodern view of that would be like, well, let's look at each of those things. Are they really bad? And sort of analyze it, I guess, and say, well, you know what? There's no moral absolutes. It's not really bad to commit adultery because you've only been told it's bad to commit adultery. There's no real information that proves it's bad. Is that somewhat correct? I feel like
more or less. Something. I mean, a more popular term that I've heard people throw around before for that kind of concept would be moral relativism. It's the idea that what's true for you is true for you, what's true for me is true for me, but there's no absolute right and wrong, which again I find is a dangerous concept. But that's why some people find the Bible offensive. And part of the reason why I feel like some people oppose Christianity is because of Christianity's place in the world for so long has always been so prevalent and dominant because, after, um, I can't remember, I think it was the third century. I think it was the third century, and the Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire,
Right.
and then the church became infused with the state, and um, a lot of good was done, a lot of corruption was done. Some things were done that were good for the world, some things were done that were evil, um, and not everybody who within the church at that time was doing what was right. And there's a lot of corruption and things like that that went along throughout the centuries. But um, part of why I think Christianity is so offensive to so many people, just for example, because we brought up, that's my faith, and you brought it up, is that the Christianity is a very exclusive religion, and postmodernism advocates for inclusivity. And so what we end up having is the conflict that while people would say that they, for a lot of young Christians, the thing that was popular, at least 10 years ago, that was popular to say was, we love Jesus but not the church. This is where you have things like the emerging church movement that came along that were very progressive young Christians who questioned a lot of the preconceived notions and a lot of the theological understandings from over the centuries, which is good to question. There's nothing wrong with asking those questions, but the problem is that their response was almost a futurist kind of view of things in a way, which was to turn away from the understanding and the traditions of previous generations, because somehow we know better now as 21st century Americans who are educated. We have a college degree, and so we clearly know better than these old people who didn't understand how science worked, for instance. And C.S. Lewis referred to that as chronological snobbery, which I think is a proper way to describe that. And so what you end up having with this idea of postmodernism is you have this idea of moral relativism. It's acceptable to say that all roads lead to heaven, all religious roads lead to heaven, whether it be Hindu, whether it be Buddhist, whether it be Muslim, whether it be Sikh, or even atheistic. There's everyone can go to heaven. It doesn't matter. That's universalism, and within Christianity, that's a heresy, because it's very clear within the scriptures that the only way to heaven is through Jesus, and so it's a very exclusive thing. There's a lot of people who would over the years would be saying that they even people who aren't Christians who talk about how Jesus was a good man, and I agree. Obviously, I believe he's God, and so that to me is like he's the best man. He's not just a good man; he's the best one. And they're willing to look at the ideas that he talked about with love and with social justice, for instance, just to use a buzzword for our time now. He took care of the poor. He looked out for the oppressed. He looked out for women in society. He healed the sick. He fed the hungry. He did all these wonderful things that we see as virtuous, that are good. But they overlooked the fact that he also claimed that he was God. He overlooked the fact that he said that the only way to heaven was through him. They overlooked certain fundamental things that he said. They overlooked the fact that he talked about hell more than anybody else in the entire Bible, because those are not nice things to look at. And so
the narrative that they want either. Not that it's not a nice thing to look at to me. I feel like the things that you just mentioned, like Jesus claiming that he's God, doesn't fit the narrative, because if you're going to believe in postmodern thought, which is that sort of everything is one, and there is no moral absolute and there's no real truth, then how could there be a God? How could his claim even be true from their point of view? And for me, that's sort of like the point where people who subscribe to that sort of thought process find themselves thinking that they're intellectually superior somehow, because they've read a few blogs and they've read, they have a lot of information that they know. Yet, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but part of the issue that postmodern thinkers have with the church is from past, like you were saying, events that happened or things that the church did that were not necessarily positive. One that comes to mind for me is the situation of Galilei versus the
sorry, I can't
church.
I think of Bohemian Rhapsody whenever I hear that. I'm sorry.
Well, you know, for in that situation, the guy who, essentially submitted his theories for approval, and they were like, you know what, nah, we have no real proof of what, that the Earth isn't really the center of the universe, or even the solar system, but we just believe that, and you're wrong. And I feel like that same story, or that same sort of narrative had repeated itself over history, especially when you come to the point of the Enlightenment, where true research is being done, where there's actual like evidence, there's actual scientific proof of these things, and that there's real things are being discovered. So science is beginning to be looked at. Okay, this is this great thing because we're discovering truth, and it wasn't. And the church has seemed like it was in opposition to that all along, or at least behind. And so I feel like there became this like dichotomy of like, well, we're finding real truth here, we're discovering real things, and you guys are just over there just disagreeing with everything we say. And just like with any relationship, if you have something like that, those type of disagreements continue over a long period of time, it's going to sort of dissolve into basically bitterness and um, uh, anger towards each other. And I feel like to a great extent that's where the church is in relation to just about everybody else now, because we have so many people who've been institutional. I mean, we all go to public school and we get taught evolution. If you don't have the proper um, lens to view evolution through, you might think that every single thing that you get taught in a textbook is true as a child, because we're most impressionable at those points. So what's essentially happened, I feel, is that there's almost been like almost a religious conversion in a way, except it's scientific, so to speak. And this religious conversion is an anti-Christian conversion, if you will. I don't know. What do you think?
I agree, but I also think it's more complicated than that. There's a lot of things within the postmodern movement. Postmodernism it's a rejection of the modern era. That's basically, as far as my understanding of it, that's the basic understanding or definition of postmodernism. You don't have to throw all the big words that they put in that definition in there. It's the response to the modern era. And you look at the modern era, what was it? It was the rise and fall of fascism, of communism, of National Socialism, of the structures that have been put in place throughout the colonial eras. It was the rise and fall of empires. It was the invention and advancement of new technologies. It was the formation of the standard American family, for instance. A mom, a dad, a couple of kids, a pet or two, living in the suburbs, that kind of thing. And postmodernism is a rejection of all of that. And so it's taking the moral values, for instance, just to continue with the thread of morality, is taking those moral values that were held in modernity and rejecting them and trying to replace them with things that philosophers and scholars have, which for the record, I use those terms very loosely, that they've come up with because they don't like the way the system has been put in place. Now, you mentioned it's almost been a religious conversion, having gone through public school and having to go through these kind of things and understand these kind of things. I agree, but it's also purely indoctrination in some ways. There's a lot of things, there are basic things that you learn in school that you should learn in school, like, how to do math, how to read, how to write, how to think. You should really be learning how to ask questions, and it should be welcome. And in a lot of schools it is. I think I may have shared this example before, but I remember when I was in high school getting kicked out of a biology class because I questioned evolution. And I wasn't even a Christian at the time. I was just asking some questions about some flaws that I saw in the argument. And my asking that question was subversive enough to the narrative that I had to be kicked out of the class because it was affecting the rest of the students. And that's not okay, and that's not acceptable. And so I feel like when we talk about postmodernism, it's big, it's broad, it's complex because it goes beyond just a single topic. But really, if you want to get at the heart of it, you need to go back to the modern era, see what it is, understand what happened in that time frame. Usually, the modern era is like the late 18 or the early to mid 1800s through the the mid 1900s, and then postmodernism began after that. That's where you start seeing things like the
Basically after
counterculture of the 1960s. You start seeing the protests in Vietnam. You start seeing increased drug use. You start seeing all these other things that were countercultural to what had been set in place for about 150 years before that.
Yeah, that's a great. I think that's a great analysis of the timetable too, because you do see like post World War II, the second half of the 20th century, where you had the sort of like American family, the quote American family of how you mentioned it, the couple kids and the pet and living in the suburbs, and then that sort of began to disappear after some point. Of course, it took time, but if you look at today with a lot of the lifestyles that are being lived by the people who are sort of like millennials, people who are basically of age now at this point, to working adults, old enough to have families if they do. You see a lot of single people. You see a lot of people not having kids, but they do have pets. They live, in the cities or wherever, and they work their jobs, and then they hang out with their friends. And that's sort of what it is. I guess that's what the American dream has become, because if you look at people or families in general, that's rapidly becoming a minority. And I guess I'm sort of focusing on that point out of everything that we've talked about, but that seems to be where it's gone. So you've gone from like the American dream being a literal family with, the standard sort of, I guess, classical family unit, to being either a single person or possibly a same-sex marriage with maybe even an adopted kid or some pets. And that's all within the last 60 years or so, give or take 60, 70 years. And it's very interesting to see how things changed in the universities, in the institutions, to where certain things that were taught before were no longer taught, or the teaching methods changed. Like you said in your class, you weren't able to ask an honest question of a topic, when you were just you were literally shut down because it didn't agree with what was being taught. And I think that speaks to the level of, you used the word indoctrination. I feel like it's a harsh word, but it's a true word, and I think that just speaks to the level of indoctrination, and to put it bluntly, that's happening in the schools. And that was what, 10, 15 years, maybe even 20 years ago now for you, when you were in school doing that.
Not that old.
Okay, 10 years. 10 years? Got to be 10 years, right? High school?
Yeah, probably. 10, 15, about 15. I'm just saying not 20. I'm not that old.
Sorry, I didn't mean to date you, but that's kind of disturbing. Sorry, that's kind of disturbing to me, because I've got kids, and it leaves you wondering, because I've got kids who are in the public school. I've got one kid in the public school. She's in preschool, granted, but so she hasn't gotten to that point. But I guess that concerns me, that they're going to be teaching that similar postmodern thought. And I feel like the postmodern thought, while it preaches sort of like everything works, like what'd you say, moral relativism and inclusivism, I think, while it preaches those things, in practice or in effect, it's doing quite the opposite, where it's shutting down free thinking. It's shutting down true questioning of anything that it doesn't agree with, I guess. So that's disturbing to me, because it seems like the exact opposite is occurring. And to sort of bring this full circle from like the augmentation into the postmodern philosophy, I feel like there's actually, while we're gaining like a lot of knowledge of like in our heads about like maybe interesting things or like historical things, but predominantly probably like social media type things, I feel like there's a lot that's being lost too, because people are able to read a blog article or a news article, one paragraph in, or maybe not even get that far and read the title of the article and say that they know things.
Mm-hmm.
So say that they know what it's about. And I feel like these institutions are counting on that. They're counting on that happening, because what it's actually doing is reducing everything down. The information, it's condensing it all into a soundbite. It's condensing the information into a headline, into a YouTube video, into whatever you want to say.
Mm-hmm.
And their knowledge is actually true knowledge, critical thinking, the ability to critically think about anything is truly being lost, I think, or it's becoming a lost art.
Well, yeah, I think so. But part of that too is that they are teaching critical thinking, but this is what always happens, is that those in authority get to define the terms. And so, for instance, when I was finishing up my degree, one of my capstone courses had a series of topics that we had to go through each week, and one of them was critical thinking, and was not hard at all. It really wasn't critical thinking, but that's what they were teaching it as.
They're calling it, they're packaging it as critical thinking.
Basically, yeah, and basically what it was reading comprehension and seeing if you're paying attention. And so that's not critical thinking. That's just being able to read something and to understand it and to, regurgitate what you just read. For instance, I liken it to the scientific theory or the scientific method. And this is another thing that I think we've probably talked about at some point during the show in the past. A major concern that I have is that the scientific method is being lost. And it's because we're taking our preconceived notions, our presuppositions into the academic circle or into the professional sphere. And what we're doing is we are taking the things that we think are going to happen, our hypothesis, and we're attempting to prove our hypothesis. And that's not ever what the scientific method is supposed to be about. What it's supposed to be about is you form your hypothesis based on whatever it is that you're trying to understand, and then you try to prove it wrong, and you try to falsify it. And this I keep mentioning game theory, but that's my background. It's with game theory that you present the case, you present the problem, and then you branch out and you see the possible positives, the possible negatives. You examine every avenue you possibly can, and as you go through these things, you start to see, okay, this isn't going to work, so let's go back to the drawing board. When, like, to go back to the idea of nuclear weapons, just for the sake of the analogy, I'm sure that you're familiar with, I think most people are familiar with the idea of mutually assured destruction. It was the prevailing notion during the Cold War that we're not going to nuke the Russians aren't going to nuke us, because if they launch, we'll launch, and if we launch, they'll launch, and then it'll just wipe out all of the life on the planet, and so we're all going to die. And so if you're using that as either critical thinking or game theory, what you're seeing is the option is, the starting point, you go to, do we attack or do we not? And if you follow the attack path, let's see where that goes. Okay, we attack them, they attack us. What's the fallout if that happens? If either one of us attacks, there's going to be mass destruction, there's going to be massive casualties, there's going to be fallout, there's going to be disease, there's going to be nuclear winter, and ultimately pretty much all the life on the earth is going to die. So that's a bad choice. Let's go back to the start and let's try a different route. And that, I feel like, is at large being neglected within academic societies and within public schools. And you mentioned the introduction and the indoctrination of postmodern thought into the public school system, especially for your daughter, who's in school. And with those kind of things, like, as somebody who went, I think you went through public school too, like, we learn how to think. Like, everyone can learn how to think, but my concern is when it's happening to small children, like your daughter's very young, like, that's when kids are most influential. And that's why it's so important for parents to be engaged as well. And you had something you want to say. I'm kind of going off on a tangent. Go ahead.
Well, I wanted to piggyback off that thought you just referred to, and where the ability to think critically is the ability to make an informed decision based on information. Would that be an accurate statement, or at least somewhat?
Yeah, it's good enough.
Yeah, I mean, it's simple, but it's
as good as any other one.
But as you're saying that, it just brought this thought to mind, and I kind of feel like it's going to bring our conversation full circle. in certain instances, artificial intelligence is being given those rights, and if you will. In other words, let's take the Facebook example or the Google search. We'll do Facebook. So your Facebook feed has sort of a hodgepodge of information, images, posts, advertisements that goes through your feed, and it's looked at through an algorithm, artificial intelligence algorithm, that chooses what appears there for you based on what it thinks is going to be the best. So in essence, the artificial intelligence is doing the critical thinking and making an informed decision based on the information it has of what it thinks you're going to want to see on your Facebook page based on your previous choices. So, and Google search is basically doing the same thing as well. So the point I'm trying to make is that artificial intelligence is sort of taking the place, or is poised to take the place of this critical thinking, because I think, like you're saying, and I agree with you, that true critical thinking in its purest form is being sort of is dying a slow death, at least in the institutions, because it's being labeled, as you said, as something else. They're packaging reading comprehension and listening as, this is critical thinking. Can you repeat what was already told to you?
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, we're losing the true ability to be able to think critically and make informed decisions. And that responsibility is being given to artificial intelligences, if that makes sense. And I'm not saying in all avenues of life. I just gave a couple specific, examples, being Facebook and Google. But if we continue down that road, if you will, I could see the number of Facebook and Google's in increasing in our lives, all in the name of making things easier for us. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think that's. I think that sounds good. I think that the issue also is nobody likes to think there's a conspiracy, and I don't really want to go down the conspiracy route right now.
Yeah, and I'm not saying conspiracy, but
I know
I'm
you're
just
not.
saying, like, whether we believe it or not, whether we see this thing happening, Facebook, Google, they are using artificial intelligence to show us what they think we want to see. They're making a decision that we should be able to make for ourselves for us. So they're taking the power of the decision making out of our Google search, out of our Facebook feed. I remember when Facebook feed and Instagram used to be a literal feed of in chronological order of every post, right? All your friends, every post would show up there. Bang, 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 boom. I could choose which ones I wanted to read or even which ones I wanted to remove. And you could still do that, but I could literally manage my own feed if I wanted to and scroll through what I wanted to see. And the point being, you can still do that on Facebook. You can still scroll through your automated feed, but I'd rather not miss certain things that artificial intelligence thinks I wouldn't like, if that makes sense. Like, I don't want that decision of what gets put in front of me to be made for me.
Right. And that's why you need to stop using Google.
Well, yeah, exactly. And that's why I don't use Facebook either. It just irritates the snot out of me.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, that's the best option you have there if you want to have that kind of freedom and control over your content, is to use something like DuckDuckGo, which doesn't filter out your content like that. They just give you the straight up result. It's not always as good of a search as Google is, but it is what it is, and they don't track you, which I think is nice. But if you want the convenience, you're going to have to deal with it. But I don't know. I just think that that's the whole point of the show, really, is to share a thoughtful discussion, but it's also to help people to just have some stuff to chew on, to kind of do mental exercises, think about stuff, talk about it with their friends and stuff. But I feel like trying to come back to what we were talking about. I know you weren't mentioning. I wasn't saying that you were bringing up a conspiracy theory. I was just saying there are elements within society that I think people should be aware of, that I think that we should probably discuss maybe in a later episode. But when we talk about the censorship and the control of the flow of information in the media and in education and in certain things, then I think that there's an avenue that we should look at as far as, who maybe has a vested interest in having a population who is consumed with bread and circuses, as the Romans would have said, because they're out there. But I think that's probably a good note to close on, since that's a whole other episode worth this.
Another can of worms. I'm already like, what can we talk? But I totally agree with you, Dan. And for those of you who are watching the show, and we really appreciate you guys, that's essentially what Dan and I are doing. Is just you can see us thinking on the show, and that's what we're trying to do. We're doing our best to think critically about certain subjects and discuss the information. We're not here to say that we're always right on every single topic. We're not here to say that we're right any of the time. These are just our thoughts and critical thoughts of the subject matter that we present here, and what we think is interesting to us. So we really do appreciate you guys. We appreciate the viewers. We really appreciate your guys' feedback. What can we improve on? What are some of the subjects that we can talk about? Because I think, like a lot of you who are watching, we really just enjoy like a good discussion that gets your brain going. It's like a physical workout. It's like going to the gym, and pumping some weights. Only we're doing it here for our brains and our and that type of a benefit. So yeah, just to end with that, I hope you guys were at least entertained and heard some interesting information on this episode. You guys can always follow us in the channels that are listed below. Dan will actually mention all that stuff as he's closing out, but thank you guys again.
All right. And as Chris said, we want to thank you guys for tuning in tonight. It's been a lot of fun. We've had a really deep, thoughtful conversation in a while. It's been kind of just nonsense the last few times we've been on here, but I hope that you guys have enjoyed it. I hope that it maybe gave you something to think about, or maybe you just think we're crazy, and that's cool too. Let us know in the comments below. If you want, you can also head on over to twowiseguys.org and check out this episode show page. It'll be at twowiseguys.org/TWG13. And there's going to be lots of show notes in there. I've been kind of taking notes as we've been going along. So there's tons of articles I'm putting in there, especially when it comes to the idea of AI, AGI, and ASI. So there'll be some stuff in there. So Chris, you might even want to go read it for yourself, because there's a lot of good stuff I found in there, as well as all the articles and things that we referenced throughout the show are going to be there. And again, that's at twowiseguys.org/TWG for the full show notes there. If you guys want to send us your feedback, we'd love to hear from you. You can email us directly at twowiseguysorg@gmail.com. You can send us a message on Twitter at twowiseguyshow, or you can just visit the YouTube video or the show page on the website and leave a comment there, and we'll respond to you. If you would like, we would appreciate it if you could like, share, and subscribe. That way you get the notifications and the straight uploads for our latest episodes as they come up. We do the shows on Saturdays. I usually try to have the podcast uploaded the following Sunday, if not Monday, depending on how busy I am that week. Yeah, so if you would mind, I would appreciate that. I'm sure Chris would as well. If you want to follow us on social media, I already mentioned the Two Wise Guys Show Twitter account. We're also on Facebook at facebook.com/twowiseguys. We'd really love to hear your feedback, to have you part of the show with us when we do the live feed. If you want to support the show, you can head over to Patreon at patreon.com/twowiseguys. If you don't want to donate the money, or you can't donate the money, you can still help the show out by leaving a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. Or if you don't want to do that, then you can also just help us out by spreading the word and helping people to find the show, and maybe they'll be able to, learn something or take something away, or maybe spark some questions that they can send into the show. So we'd really appreciate that. But that's all we got for this week. And the next episode will be 2 Saturdays from now. That's going to be the 24th of February. And we'll be back here again at 7:30 Eastern, 4:30 Pacific time. And until then, calendar. Yes, mark your calendar. You can hit the go to the Two Wise Guys page as well, and at the top of the site there's going to be a video feed for the next episode. So if you want to do it that way too, that'll help too. But anyways, until next time, I'm Dan, and Chris is over there doing his thing. But we just want to thank you again for checking out the episode, and until next time, stay woke.
Take care, everyone. We love you. Until next time, be safe.